Well, I'm a pretty proud Texan. How about y'all? Okay, well, we're going to be talking about historical Texas, and we're going to be talking about several aspects of historical Texas. And this is found in the prologue, and this lecture is split up into two parts. So let's get started on historical Texas. So in this particular lecture, what we're going to be talking about is what makes Texas different from other states, because you have to agree, or I would say most people agree, that Texas is different than most other states. Texas is like its own country, right? All right. Well, as I said, I'm a proud Texan, but you know what? Texas has a pretty sordid and colorful past, and we're going to be talking about some of these issues. And so the question is, well, why are we so proud? But guess what? We are proud Texans, aren't we? And more than anything else, in this particular lecture, we're going to be looking at the political adjustments made in the state of Texas. That means that Texas looks one way now, which is like a pretty conservative state, but it's changing. Even as we speak, it is changing. So it's gone through different renditions of what it looks like, and so these are called political adjustments if quite flips from one party to another party. Okay, the first one I want to talk about is way back in the olden days when Texas was a republic. And what that means then is that Texas used to be its own nation. I'm sure y'all know that. You should know that if you're a Texan. And if you're not a Texan, I'm telling you, Texas used to be its own country, its own nation. And so at that time, it wasn't so much that we had political parties and it was, like the Democrats against the Republicans or whatever. The political issue at that time was, should Texas become a state, or should Texas become a separate nation? Should it stay a separate nation? And so there are a couple of legends, if you want to call them Texas heroes, that you should be kind of familiar with. And the first one is Sam Houston. And so what Sam Houston was saying was that he wanted the U.S. to become part of the U.S., or wanted Texas to become part of the U.S., because he saw that there could be a civility and that there could be cultural, even though there were cultural differences, that he thought that the Anglo-Saxon population, could integrate with the Native American population, which is kind of predominant at that time in the state of Texas. And so he was pushing for Texas to join the Union, to join the statehood. So they're known as the pro-Houston people, that they wanted to join the Union. Then there was this other guy, on the other hand, his name was, I think, Mirabeau Lamar. And so he's saying, no, I don't see that Texas can ever have can coexist with anyone who's not Anglo, who's not of the Anglo-Saxon ethnicities. And so he says there's too many cultural differences. I do not support that at all. I think we should stay our own nation. Okay, well, and so during this time, some of the backdrop to all of this was that slavery was still a big deal in Texas. As we were going to be annexing, then the question was, well, what do we do about the slaves? Because in those times in the state of Texas, slavery was legal, and that a slave was considered to be the personal property of that owner, of the person that bought the slave. But anyway, okay, so Texas was finally annexed in 1845, and it became the 28th state. Now, some of the peculiarities that occurred as we were becoming a state, or these are like deals that were cut for Texas to become a state. First of all, Texas is so big that it could divide itself up into 4 states plus the state of Texas, or the one known as the state of Texas, so as many as 5 states. It still has the ability to do that. Says Texas can keep its public lands, and so the reason, because most of the time when the government came, when a state became part of the United States, or a territory became part of the United States, the federal government came and took the public lands. Well, Texas had, because it was a nation, we had a lot of debt, and so the United States said, well, Texas, we don't want your debt, so you get to keep your own public lands to pay your own debt. Okay, Texas at that time could secede from the Union, which basically says they could draw away from the Union. That's not so true anymore, but at that time, when Texas was annexing, that was one of the peculiarities of the annexation agreement. Okay, after the Civil War, and I was talking about slavery, and so the Civil War was about slavery. So this is after that point, after what happened with the Civil War. And so at that time, Texas was had to have a new constitution, and we had to draft a new constitution, and it was finally adopted in 1869. And it was at that time that we elected this one guy by the name of E.J. Davis as governor of the state of Texas. But he was not really a very good governor. There were a lot of irregularities in his particular administration, a lot of corruption in his administration. And as a matter of fact, he mishandled that office so badly, it kind of jaded us or shaped the way that we think about government and about politics in the state of Texas. But I will cover more of that when I cover the Constitution. Okay, so Texas was readmitted into the Union and it was governed by civil authority. And so what happened at that time is that means like, we the people are going to, as opposed to the military, we're going to be governing the state of Texas. And so when they drafted this constitution, what happened is that they centralized all of the power in the office of the governor. And so because they gave a lot of power to one person, it uh, it led to the propensity, if that one person wanted to abuse the office, he could easily abuse the office. So all the power that was centralized set it up so that a particular governor, whoever it would have been, in this case it was E.J. Davis, kind of like really messed it up. So anyway, so the legacy was, okay, and E.J. Davis was a Republican. It was a strong anti-Republican reaction, a strong anti-Republican reaction. That means like to the Republican Party. And Davis was kicked out. I mean, he was kicked out. I mean, they actually physically had to kick him out. Okay, so then they said, okay, well, we're going to have a new constitution, or the Texas framers, I should say, said we have to have a new constitution. And so this new constitution is going to reflect a new type of ideology. This is the one where the political adjustment starts to come in, where there's going to be a new constitution that's going to be a new constitution that's going to be more frugal in the way that we're going to talk about things. It's going to reflect a new ideology. It's going to be a new day for Texas. We're going to cut expenditures. We're going to decentralize the state government. No more decentralization in one office. No way. We're going to limit the flexibility of the politicians. So that's already saying we don't want a lot of government in our lives, and that's the one that's still in use today. So the political consequences of this particular section of time or moment in time is that all of a sudden the political adjustments were that we became a one-party dominant state, and that one party was the Democratic Party. So it was a Democratic rule for eons and eons and eons until the 1970s and more so the 1990s. Okay, another time, period of time is 1914 to 1918. I'm not covering all the sections, just the ones that I think are the most important when it's talking to you about different things that were really crucial in the state of Texas that led to these political adjustments. Okay, so 1914 to about 1918, there was this one guy named Farmer Jim, James E. Ferguson. And so this was a time of prohibition, or in other words, you can't sell alcohol. This was a time of the bootleggers. It was should the United States be wet? Should they be dry? There was an amendment that was passed, etc., etc. And so Farmer Jim ran on the platform that he wanted Texas to be a wet state for alcohol to be allowed. And not only that, they call him Farmer Jim because he ran on a platform where he said, I see that there's a lot of Texas tenant farmers out there, and they're working hard for the owner, but they're getting nothing in return for it. So it's a way to get them to be to share in the profits of all that. So there were programs for Texas tenant farmers. Hard to say. All right, but again, there were irregularities in his administration, and there were big time irregularities in his administration. There was a lot of corruption in his administration. And so this guy was actually impeached. This is why this is important. He was impeached and he was convicted of 21 charges. He was removed from public office and barred from ever holding public office in Texas again. So it was like the worst politician. So there's two. There's E.J. Davis, and then this guy Jim Ferguson. And so the 18th Amendment was ratified, and so at that time the U.S. and Texas were dry. And here in the state of Texas, we still have some areas that are county by county or even city by city that can elect to stay dry. Not everybody sells liquor everywhere, especially like in the Dallas region. We used to have a situation here in our region in Portland, but they became eventually became what, and really not that long ago. I want to say like maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. All right. So in 1921, there was an issue with the Ku Klux Klan. Surely y'all know who the Ku Klux Klan is, right? Okay, the Ku Klux Klan is a pro-white, racial, Southern, fundamentalist mortality. Okay, these are the ones that go after minorities, especially the African American population, and they kill them. So anyway, so they were starting to become a major political issue in the 20s, 21 to about 25. They were starting to gain political influence, political clout. And so this was not a good thing. And this was under this governor by the name of Pat M. Neff. And so then the question was, okay, well, how do we neutralize this Ku Klux Klan so that they do not have as much power and as much influence in the state of Texas? Because that's not something that Texas wanted to have to deal with. Okay, so then in 1924, the next election cycle for the governor's race, there was this one woman by the name of Miriam A. or Ma Ferguson. Now look at that name Ferguson. Well, it just happens to be the wife of James Ferguson, the one that got impeached. Okay, this was the wife, and she ran on an anti-Klan gubernatorial platform, and she said, you know what? I know a way to neutralize the Ku Klux Klan and to end them as a political force in the state of Texas. And so what she did is she passed a piece of legislation, or she championed it, well, because the legislature is the one that passes the legislation. But that piece of legislation just basically said, in the state of Texas, you cannot wear a mask in public. So there you go, right? But anyway, so she was our first female governor, and we've really only had two female governors in the state of Texas. She was the first. All right, after World War II, uh, this is a story about LBJ, and everybody knows who LBJ is, right? All right, so he was running for Senate. This is the first time that he went up to Washington D.C. as a senator, and so the question at that time or was the way that he was elected, and he was elected based on fraud. And so what happened is that the way that the votes were being counted, the way that people were voting, there was a lot of irregularities. It was a very controversial campaign. It was election fraud. And it wasn't just LBJ, it was also the other guy, Coke Stevenson. That's who he was running against. And this was like in the primary, for the primary for whoever's going to be elected. And so I'm not good. This is kind of like a big black eye for us, is because LBJ actually became president at some point, right? But anyway, so it was the closest election. It happened here in this area, guys. It's Box 13, which at that time was in Jim Wells County. Now it's in Duval County. But there was well, they're called political machines, and it's basically like one family. In this particular instance, it was the Parr family that was really kind of running the show, and they were kind of like strong arming people to vote in a different, whichever way they wanted them, whatever. And so there was just like a lot of election fraud. It wasn't like a free and clear election, which is the one of the hallmarks of democracy, right? But anyway, so 87 vote difference. They did a recount. It still came out in LBJ's favor, but barely. So he was elected by election fraud. It was declared the winner by election fraud. So as I said, both of them, there was fraud on both parts. It's just that LBJ kind of outfrauded him. I think that's the term that the book uses. He was outfrauded. I thought that was kind of funny myself. Okay, then we get to more current times, and I know current, you're saying, are you kidding me? This is like way in the olden days. Well, all right then. 1950s. This was a political adjustment time too, and this kind of was a big one for us and for the state of Texas. And this involved a time, and it was when a particular person was running for the governor's office, and his name was Alan Shivers. And so at that time, there was an issue going on here in the state of Texas, and that issue was, how are we going to count the royalties, or the number, the measurements that are going out to sea, because we're getting our money from that. Okay, so it's jurisdictional territory, jurisdictional bound, how to measure those boundaries. Okay, we had always done it using the Spanish measure, which is 10 miles. So it's like whatever oil and gas we're getting from 10 miles out from the coast, that belongs to the state of Texas. Well, you know what? The federal government didn't like that. They said, nope, we don't want that. We're losing money. We, the U.S. government, is losing money. We want to change it. We want to change it to 3 miles instead of the 10 miles. Well, Texas was very, very upset because they were saying, well, that's not fair. It's always been like that. That means there's going to be a lot less money for us in terms of royalty revenues. And what they use the royalty revenues for, it's called a permanent fund, and a lot of it is funds education. Not so much like the regional universities like ours, but more for the flagship universities like UT Austin and A&M College Station. Okay, well, around this time, there was a person that was running for president, and his name was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'm sure you've probably heard of him. And so Eisenhower spent some time in Texas. I think he kind of grew up here, and so he kind of took Texas and took this particular issue to heart and said, "I'm going to help the state of Texas because I feel very strongly that they are getting screwed." And so the a political adjustment here is that the conservative Democrats were so thankful to Eisenhower that they endorsed him and they voted him in for president. So Texas had been such a Democratic state, Democrat, Democrat, Democrat. So all of a sudden they elected a Republican. That the Democrats had get a Republican elected. Okay, so these are known as shivercrats, and so this is the political adjustment. The political adjustment was that there started to be split ticket voting, and what that means that they will vote for for president is voted or the president is always voted in from the Republican Party, and this has been going on from the 50s, and then at all of the other levels they were the Democrats. So it went like this for a long time until 2002, and I'll cover that part in a little while. Um, and so that split ticket voting, it kind of like broke up the party and the way the factions within this party because there's another Texas legend, Ralph Yarbrough, said, no, if you are a Democrat in Texas, you need to be loyal to the Democratic Party. You need to be a yellow dog Democrat. And he kind of coined that term, a yellow dog Democrat. You have to support the Democratic Party to the end. Well, it didn't exactly turn out that way because from the 1950s on, the president that we elected from the state of Texas has always been Republican, or up to this point anyway. Okay, so some of the results of this Tidelands issue that I was talking about, that the issue was revolved in Texas's favor, but what it did is it split up the party into two factions. There's a more liberal faction and then a more conservative faction. When I cover political parties, we will talk about the factions, and both parties have the same basically types of factions. There's like the establishment Democrats, if you want to call it that, and the more progressive ones, the establishment Republicans, and then the more conservative ones, liberal and conservative. Okay, so it just kind of depends. But in this particular instance, it's talking about the Democratic Party. And so the liberals were known as the Yellow Dog Democrats, and the conservative party, this conservative wing of the Democratic Party, were known as the Blue Dog Democrats. So that was a political adjustment. It split up the party into two. For the president, Texas was voting for the Republican candidate. The Democratic Party started to fracture. It's not wasn't so much loyalty to the one party. They're saying you're going to show me why I should vote for you, and either you're more liberal or you're more conservative. That's kind of been coming out in like recent elections, like where should we stand or whatever. It's an issue for political parties. So when we talk about political parties, I'll talk a lot more about this. Okay, so Shivers was elected for 3 terms, and so there are again many scandals, many not so much corruption, but it's more like let's see, how can I say? When people contribute money to different candidates' campaigns, they can only spend money on certain things. So it was more like where this money was coming from and where it was going to, like the revenues coming in and then the expenditures going out. And so Texas had to enact some of the first campaign, or some of the first legislation, I should say, to try to control the amount of the money that was coming in by these lobby groups, and we'll talk a little bit about the lobby groups when we talk about campaign and elections. But basically, it's saying, okay, just because you're giving these people money doesn't mean that you should be buying these politicians. So it's trying to curb that. It's trying to set up standards so that that cannot happen. It's called ethics in campaign and finance. But anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on.